Hello, I'm Jerry Hancock from Men in Balance. We have a special treat today, an interview with Dr. Jody Seymour, former pastor, senior pastor at Davidson United Methodist Church, and a man who will not retire. Hello, Jody.
Hello, Jerry.
So tell me what you're doing now. You're doing a fill-in pastor? What is that?
Well, what I did, I retired almost 4 years ago and was retired 6 months. And then I did a 6-month interim in Statesville, another one in Statesville, 3 months in Salisbury. And then I was filling in for a young man in China Grove, about a 60-member church. And unfortunately, he died of a stroke. So they asked me to stay on full-time. It's a quarter-time appointment, but it's technically full-time. So it's about 65 people, and it's a whole lot different than 4,000.
Yeah. So tell me how that's going. I mean, that is a small congregation, but I guess it has its pros and cons, right?
Well, my first interim was about 200 members, and what I realized, it's very different. You have to go out and make sure the sound system's on. I didn't have any handlers, but here's the plus side is within 3 weeks I knew everybody, and in 13 years at Davidson, I love my people, but I guess 85% of the folks I didn't really know. So little churches, very intimate. You don't have the resources. You have to be a little bit different focus in preaching, but you get to know people.
That's really good. Well, before we get into the heavy stuff, tell me about the family. What's everybody up to?
Doing good. Of course, we're all confined like everybody, but we're enjoying our 4-year-old grandson, Jace, and he doesn't live but a few miles away. So we stayed away from him for a long time. But, I think what's happening, more and more people are just starting to widen the circle when it comes to family. And so the last month, in fact, they've come to the beach with us, and we go over and play with them in the pool. So Betsy's garden is in full bloom. She loves her gardening. And Amanda, the youngest, is doing very well in real estate. And then Abigail, who's in Atlanta, she's only working part-time now because she works out of her home. And then her husband, Jay, is unfortunately or fortunately with Delta, so he's only working part-time too. But they're happy.
Mm. Well, one of the things I wanted to talk about today, in fact, was this COVID-19 virus and the fact and the impact it's had on everybody. I guess one of my first questions to you is, for the people who are looking at this as some sort of calamity, what do you say about where is God in COVID-19?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a thing right when this first started, when we first were in shock about because we're very humbled by this. I mean, this little old tiny unknown enemy has really shown we're not in much control. But I think in terms of the Judeo-Christian tradition, this is another form of exile, and we're not used to exile in America, and this is forced exile, and that's what happened in the Bible numbers of times. And the people, when they started kind of blaming God or asking where God was, what God basically said was, well, what are you going to learn in the exile? Because the wrong question to ask is, well, why would God do this to us? And so what I've used is that passage, if God is for us, who is against us? Well, the truth is there are a number of things against us, and this thing is against us. And it does make you question or lift up your theology. But Jerry, for many years, one of the main things I did as a pastor is to help people kind of grow up with their faith. You remember Paul said, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I acted, and when I grew up, I gave up childish ways. Well, what happens in faith, Jerry, is that unless we need to grow up, we sometimes don't. We take our childhood faith with us, and we don't really have to have anything else until we're faced with very complex, quote unquote, adult situations. And then you have to start thinking, well, maybe God's not that super parent in the sky who would never let anything happen to his children. Well, that's not my understanding of God.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk about that some because I can remember, as a junior high student or as an elementary school student in church, we had this idea of God then. And personally, I felt like when I grew up, that God didn't work very much for me. And yeah. So how does one move from this previous view of God to something that's more realistic?
Well, sometimes you have to, it's like with teenagers. Sometimes teenagers have to say no before they can say yes. And sometimes we have to painfully think, well, the concept we have of God, if you hold too tight with it, you're not going to like God, or God's going to be a tyrant, or God's going to be kind of an uncaring parent. So the first thing you have to do, rather than embracing some more growth in terms of God, is to kind of let go and realize, well, maybe that thing I brought with me in childhood doesn't work. Because see, what happens is if you don't, what you do is you don't let go of your concept of God, you let go of God, because the only concept you have is one that was, old and maybe childish. The favorite expression I often say when I was going through terrible times with my adolescent teenager, Amanda, we went to a therapist, and I can never forget. I thought we were going to talk about boundary issues and whatever. And the therapist had talked to Amanda first, and then she talked to me and looked at me. And Amanda was in the room and said, "You know what you're going to have to do, Jody?" And I said, "What?" She said, "You're going to have to let go." And I thought, "What am I paying you for?" And then what she said, she saw the expression on my face, and she said, "I can see you don't know the difference between letting go and giving up." So here's what I say to you, Jerry, about God. God lets go of us, just like a parent has to let go of a child to let them learn, but God never gives up. So, yes, there's a virus out there. It's awful. It's got an evil nature to it. And you can say, well, why didn't God stop the virus? Why didn't God hold us tight and protect us? Well, a parent, you can lock a kid in a room and they'll never get hurt. But we have to let our children go, and God lets us go, and we get hurt, but God never gives up. I always tell people, I use the image of, God's hands are not like this, they're like this, and there's spaces in between. And the biggest space is freedom. So,
Mm.
yes, there's tsunamis, and there's cancer, and kids getting run over by cars. And if you have a childish concept of God, childlike concept of God, then you're going to say, well, where's God? Why didn't God, the super parent, take care of me? But yet your concept of God has to expand and realize that God allows freedom, but God never gives up on us.
Um, just coincidentally, I've been watching a series about the original plague in the 1530s, and
Mm-hmm.
the culture was such that everybody thought this was a visitation of wrath of God. Uh, and they didn't know what to do with it, and in fact, even the priests were sort of mystified by it. And eventually, people turned on each other as the victim in this thing, because if you're sinning, you had to somehow be responsible for bringing this tragedy on us.
Right. Well, you know what that is? If you drill down, Jerry, that's our need for control. And when we lose control, we've got to, we're helpless. So we do something. And what people do when they lose control is they scapegoat, because that's a form of control. They can scapegoat God, they can scapegoat, the virus, Trump, uh, nature. But what this makes us do, as I tell people, there's a difference between being a religious tourist and a spiritual pilgrim. Uh, Pilgrims have to learn in the exile. And so what we have to do is decide, well, you can blame God and be mad at God, or you can try to say what Richard Rohr taught me is, if we don't learn the lessons that our pain teaches us, we will fail to discover our true self. And so what is this virus going to teach us? Because if we put our emphasis on blaming, where does that get us?
Hmm. Well, so as a people of God, what do you think the lessons are that we must get out of this?
Well, first of all, the lesson is we're not as in control as we thought we were. We have been brought on. So, I mean, think about it, medicine, science, all the different science. We get fooled into thinking, and we are more in control than the ancient people were. But there's a catch-22 to that. So now we're faced with lack of control. So, the Bible, it's a wonderful book, and it's a dangerous book. I often, in my latest book, The Christian Skeptic Caught Between Belief and Doubt, I said, the Bible is not a brick. It's not made of one substance. It's like a grandmother's quilt sewn together over in pieces of history. So if you look at the Bible in a narrative, what did the people learn in the exile? Well, they learned they had to have utter dependence on God in their helplessness. They could be mad at God. And so what I said, I don't have to make up this story. How do you sing the Lord's song in the strange land of a virus? And the answer is you sing.
Mm.
You just sing the old song. It may not make anything happen, but it may do something to you. And so I tell you, Jerry, I learned a long time ago as a working pastor, because I'm a struggler. I have a lot of questions. And I remember one time trying to help someone through a tragedy as a young pastor, and some kid had gotten killed. And I walked in, and I don't know what I said, but some young adult followed me out and said, can I say something to you? And I said, yeah. He said, I've never met a preacher like you. I said, wait a minute. He said, well, you didn't tell us not to doubt. You let us ask our questions, and you just listened. And I got in the car, and I wrote this in my book because I got a strange imagination. I kind of heard this laughter. I was in the car alone, and I heard this kind of laughter. And I heard this little voice in my imagination say, you don't have to take care of me. You don't have to answer everybody's questions, because some questions don't have any answers. What I want you to do is just be with the people in the questions.
Mm.
Because, if you think, this whole thing about God can do anything. Well, if God can do anything, God comes off really bad. But, my favorite poem is by Edward Markham. And he said, herein lies chaos, make no foolish boast. There's some God omnipotent sitting in the firmament, looking down on us like grasshoppers blown about on a windy coast, damned by disaster, maimed by mortal ill, but a God who could end it all with one blast of will. That God is a man-created ghost. But there is a God who sounds across this world his danger call. The breaker of bridges, the breaker of bars, the builder of bridges, the one pressing toward the stars, the one forever hurling back the curse, the nail-torn Christ, the hero of the battling universe. So since I'm a Christian, my image of God looks through the cross. And we made the cross too religious. Saved us for our sins. Well, okay, you can deal with it. But look at the vulnerability of God. And so, Jerry, when I was at Davidson, I had 6 crucifixes in my office. And some people thought it's because I was raised Catholic partly. But I would be with people who were in unbelievable tragedy and sometimes felt like God deserted them, and I would listen. And what I do, I'd point to one of the crucifixes and say, you see that? You know who that is? That's God hung out to dry for you when you don't get your questions answered. God is suffering with us. So in my opinion, we can blame God if we want to. God can take it. Won't do us any good except get mad at God. Or we can realize that God loves us so much. God will not control everything like this, but God is in the midst of this, struggling with the all with us. And that's why nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Tribulation, peril, viruses. So we can have 2 choices. We can go away from God and be mad, or we can allow this tragedy and suffering and questions to draw us closer to our inner being and to God.
Wow, pretty powerful. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Another question for you, because we are dealing so much with men and their issues. During this time, it's sort of discouraging to realize that the domestic violence calls are up. Separations and divorce seem to be headed in an upward trend. And so much of that is blamed on the fact that we're in close quarters and we have trouble being with each other in that way. What do you say to a man who's just dealing with the regular frustrations of that this virus has brought on, and not to let that damage his relationships?
Well, what's happening now is we have, all of us, men especially, we have this stuff inside of us. Some of it's it's a need for control, maybe it's a need to dominate. Well, what's happened is we're now that stuff is in a vice. It's being pressed in, it's concentrated, and it can be very dangerous. It's always been dangerous, because good relationships have they're equitable, they're a sharing. But as you and I know, there are many relationships before the virus that were never that to begin with. So those relationships are under pressure. So what I would say to a man is, first of all, you got to think about who you are. And this is childlike almost. Okay, if we're confined it's like you got to get out. I mean, literally. I used to tell people all the time, unless you're physically impaired, go out and exercise. Get the inside stuff, sweat, uh, get tired, because it is exercise is one of the great stress reliefs of anything. And if you don't, instead of expanding, you will contract. And contraction of power is dangerous.
Wow, that's pretty good too. Um, so in these days that we're facing now, I'm thinking a lot about churches, and the church has been sort of harmed by this because they're not able to do their full ministry. What do you think about? Is this going to change the way churches do ministry, and what do you see for the future of churches generally?
You know, the church as an institution, the mainline churches, which is what I'm part of, we were facing some big challenges before this ever happened. Uh, a lot of younger people, the old spiritual but not religious, mistrust of institutions. So we were facing challenges anyway. I don't know. I mean, first of all, just in terms of steps, literally, the church to meet again, I mean, literally to get together, it's going to be phased. And that's going to be a challenge. And like Davidson, that big old sanctuary, if you ever try to get people, social distance, there is at least a way to do it with different services. My little old church seats about 100 people. You have to you're supposed to be 6 feet apart, wear a face mask. I don't know if my folks are going to do that. So in terms of continuity and community, we're being challenged because, we always thought community was being together in a space. Well, now community has to be, how much is this community going to hold together? And you're right. I don't know what this is going to do. I am surprised. Some churches are struggling financially, obviously. Some churches, and I think Davidson may be one of them, they seem to be doing pretty good. People, they're not together, but they know they believe enough in the church as they bring their funds in. And also, it's helped us realize that in terms of look at the social justice issues facing us. There are young people who rightly criticize the church for being self-absorbed, petty, prejudicial, judgmental, and only taking care of itself. Well, we're now being challenged because the society needs something like the in my tradition, the gospel lesson of the church, of the lesson of the gospel, which is the test of a society is how they treat the marginalized and the weak, and that's been exposed. So it's going to be interesting to see institutionally what comes out of this. It's a challenge, and I really, quite frankly, ministers always try to give an answer whether they have one or not, but I don't know. I don't have an answer to that one.
Well, if you could sort of imagine into the future a different kind of church and its ministry, this might be a chance to reconstruct a ministry. What would you like to add on that the church is not traditionally associated with now?
Well, the church started, this is sort of funny, they need to go backwards. The church started kind of as house churches. There's some literature out there now that may be the first thing people can do is gather in small groups. Some of the models of church that we weren't as familiar with in the mainline big institutional church is cells. You'd have people would actually, their church would be a small group of people. They would once in a while, and they would have their worship in a small way. And then once in a while, they would come together in a larger group to do projects, to worship once in a while. But the real focus and energy was in a smaller group. And that may be something the church has to look at. But when I used to marry couples, I would say a lot of these young couples, they weren't going to church, and I knew it, but they wanted to have a church wedding. I said, well, here's the deal. You got to make me 2 promises. One, if one of you ever says to the other, we got to go work on our marriage, the other person has to say yes, no matter what, because I've had so many women in my office with no men coming in. I said, I ain't marrying you unless you make me that promise. And the second one is you will explore a faith community. I said, and if you when you go out and look for a sofa, if you don't find one the first time, you keep shopping. So I want you to shop, find a community of faith, because you're asking for a Christian marriage and a Christian wedding. And here's what a good church will do for you. One, it will remind you of who you are. You didn't come out of a catalog. You were created by God, and you're a child of God. It'll remind you of that. And a good church will take you outside yourself, because we live in a self-absorbed culture. And you need to know that life ain't just about you. So a good church will push you out into helping other people. And it'll be good for you, and it'll be good for your marriage.
Wow, that is excellent. The fact is that some of us have lost folks that are very dear to us during this pandemic, and it's hard to deal with that. It's hard to explain that. I wonder if you have a sort of a prayer for individuals to accept what is in front of them, and to put their trust where it belongs in this particular situation. What would your prayer for individuals be?
Well, one of the things I think you have to do, so much of prayer that I grew up on is, asking Daddy to give us something, I guess. But what I think, when something like this pushes us back to helplessness, the first prayer, the essence of prayer is, the oldest prayer is the breath prayer. It's simply paying attention to your breath and breathing, and realizing that the word for spirit in the Bible is ruach. It's Hebrew, and it means breath, wind, and spirit. And in Hebrew, which is a guttural language, even to say the word, you have to breathe differently. And this is the way it sounds. Ruach, ruach. And so I think what we have to do in this helplessness that we are, and especially when we, part of helplessness is losing people and thinking, you think, well, why didn't God save them? Part of it is simply, and you can literally open your hands if you want to, and just, be real quiet for a while, breathe, and give God your helplessness, and give God the one you've lost. Because if God is who I believe God is just beyond our helplessness. I used to tell people all the time, Jerry, the reason I believe in God has had nothing to do with my education, the books I have, and my degrees. The reason I believe in God is for 48 years, I've been with people who have lost terrible things: children, jobs, health, their image of God. And what I have experienced, not know, but have experienced, is underneath our helplessness and our questions, there is a presence below us, holding on to us, even if we can't hold on to it. And that's God. I tell people all the time, when things are going good, you can do without God. When things fall apart, we get to our limits. And just beyond God's there all the time, but just beyond our limits, when we can't do, there's God. And so I just tell people, lean into this unknown presence that knows you.
Very good. Jody, thank you so much for that, and for your time, and for your service over the years. We certainly appreciate you. And thank you for doing this interview for Men in Balance.
You're very welcome, Jerry. Thank you for your ministry.
Thank you.